Welcome to the Pride Channel, your home for queer news, LGBTQ plus history, pop culture, entertainment, and iconic conversations.
You changed me, Dean.
Why does this sound like a goodbye?
Because it is. I love you.
For a long time, LGBTQ plus audiences have shared a very specific frustration when it comes to movies and television. It's that feeling when a queer character finally gets the thing they've been searching for all season, or sometimes for years. Maybe they finally come out. Maybe they finally admit their feelings to someone they love. Maybe they finally find acceptance, happiness, or a sense of peace. And then, almost immediately, something terrible happened. They're killed, separated from their partner, or subjected to a tragic ending that seems designed to punish them for finally being happy. This pattern became known as the bury your gays trope, and while it might sound like an exaggeration to people who haven't followed the conversation, LGBTQ plus viewers have been noticing it for decades. The issue was never that queer characters die, heroes die, villains die, everyone dies in fiction. The problem is that for a very long time, queer characters seemed to die at a much higher rate than everyone else, especially once they found love or fulfillment. Over time, these deaths stopped feeling like individual creative decisions and started feeling like part of a much larger pattern.
But I did love you. I do love you. I resented your plans to marry.
To understand why people feel so strongly about this trope, it's important to understand that it didn't appear out of nowhere. Its roots go all the way back to the early days of Hollywood. During much of the 20th century, filmmakers operated under censorship rules that made it almost impossible to portray LGBTQ plus people positively. If a queer character appeared on screen, they often had to be punished by the story. They couldn't simply ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after. Instead, they would end up alone, imprisoned, mentally unstable, or dead. Even after those censorship rules disappeared, the storytelling habits they created stuck around. Writers and studios had spent decades telling audiences that queer lives were tragic, and that mindset didn't disappear overnight.
How you feeling, Cass?
Fine.
But don't get me wrong, I'm happy you're back. I'm freaking thrilled. It's just this whole mysterious resurrection thing. Always has one mother of a downside.
Think again.
Your shirt. Tara?
One of the most famous examples came in 2002 with the death of Tara McClay from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Tara and Willow had become one of television's most beloved same-sex couples. At a time when queer representation was still relatively rare on mainstream television, their relationship meant a great deal to many viewers. Fans had watched their ups and downs, their struggles, and their eventual reconciliation. It seemed like things were finally looking up for them. Then, Tara was suddenly killed by a stray bullet that wasn't even meant for her. What made the moment especially painful was its timing. It happened immediately after Tara and Willow had reunited and found happiness again. For many viewers, it felt as though the story had dangled the possibility of joy in front of them only to snatch it away moments later. At the time, the reaction was significant, but it would take years before the full cultural conversation around the trope truly exploded. That happened in 2016 with Lexa from the 100. By then, television had changed considerably. LGBTQ plus characters were more visible than ever before, and audiences expected better representation. Lexa wasn't just another supporting character. She was a powerful leader, a fan favorite, and part of a relationship that had attracted a passionate following. Fans had spent years rooting for Lexa and Clark to be together. When they finally became a couple, viewers celebrated. Then, almost immediately afterward, Lexa was killed by a stray bullet intended for someone else. The backlash was enormous. It wasn't simply about Lexa herself. Many fans felt as though they had watched the exact same story play out repeatedly across decades of television. A queer woman finds love. A queer woman dies. The outrage spread across social media, entertainment websites, and fan communities around the world. People weren't just criticizing one show's writing choices, they were expressing frustration with an entire storytelling tradition. Lexa's death became a symbol of a much bigger issue, and it sparked industry-wide discussions about LGBTQ plus representation that continue today.
You left a hero to your people, and you returned one.
The Mountain Slayer returns with the body of the Ice Queen. You bring them justice. You bring them justice.
What's interesting is that many of the most controversial examples aren't controversial because the deaths themselves are unrealistic. Characters die in dramatic stories all the time. The problem is often the context surrounding those deaths. It's the feeling that queer happiness is temporary, while straight happiness is allowed to endure. It's the repeated pattern of allowing LGBTQ+ characters to experience a brief moment of joy before immediately punishing them for it.
Dean. Yes?
Few examples illustrate this better than Castiel from Supernatural. For years, fans debated the nature of Castiel's relationship with Dean Winchester. Was it romantic? Was it platonic? The discussion became one of the biggest topics in the show's fandom. Then, after years of speculation, Castiel finally confessed his love. It was a major moment. Fans who had been invested in the character for over a decade finally received explicit confirmation that there was something deeper there. And almost immediately afterward, Castiel was dragged into eternal damnation by a cosmic entity. Even people who weren't familiar with the history of the trope couldn't help but notice the unfortunate optics. A queer character openly expresses love and is instantly condemned to hell. Whether intentional or not, many viewers saw it as an almost absurdly literal example of the very thing fans had been criticizing for years.
Are you really fine?
I don't know, Cass. But that's what I'm supposed to say, right? I'm fine. Keep on moving.
Then there was Villanelle from Killing Eve, a character whose death reignited the conversation all over again. Villanelle was one of the most charismatic, complicated, and unpredictable characters on television. Her relationship with Eve was the emotional center of the series. Over 4 seasons, viewers watched their connection evolve from fascination to obsession to something that resembled genuine love. By the time the final season arrived, fans were eager to see where their story would end. When Villanelle and Eve finally embraced their feelings and shared a romantic moment, it seemed like the show was finally giving them the payoff audiences had been waiting for. Instead, Villanelle was shot by a sniper and killed just minutes later. The reaction was swift and furious. Once again, many fans argued that the issue wasn't simply that a character died. Villanelle was an assassin living a dangerous life. The issue was that the death occurred immediately after the relationship finally became real. To many viewers, it felt like another example of queer happiness being treated as something fleeting and unsustainable. The trope extends far beyond those 3 examples. Pussy Washington from Orange is the New Black became one of the most beloved characters on television before being accidentally killed during a confrontation with prison guards. Jack Twist from Brokeback Mountain remains one of the most heartbreaking examples in film history, dying violently and leaving Ennis to mourn the life they never got to share openly. Oberyn Martell from Game of Thrones was an openly bisexual fan favorite whose brutal death became one of the show's most shocking moments. Individually, each of these deaths can be justified within the context of their stories. Collectively, however, they contribute to a larger pattern that many viewers find impossible to ignore. What makes this conversation particularly interesting is that it has evolved significantly over time. Today, many writers and creators are far more aware of the trope than they were 20 years ago. LGBTQ+ audiences are more vocal. Social media allows fans to organize and discuss representation in ways that weren't possible before. Studios and networks understand that viewers are paying attention not only to whether queer characters exist, but also to how those characters are treated.
This is a goddamn bitch of an unsatisfactory situation.
As a result, we've started seeing more stories that actively reject the idea that queer lives must end in tragedy. Shows like Schitt's Creek became enormously popular in part because they offered a world where queer relationships could simply exist without constant suffering. Series like Heartstopper have resonated with audiences because they focus on joy, growth, friendship, and love rather than trauma. These stories aren't successful despite their optimism. They're successful because audiences were hungry for something different. Perhaps that's the most important thing to understand about the bury your gays trope. The conversation was never really about demanding that queer characters become invincible. Nobody expects every LGBTQ+ character to survive every story. What audiences want is balance. They want queer characters to have access to the same variety of stories that straight characters have always enjoyed. Some stories can be tragic, some can be triumphant, some can be bittersweet, some can be joyful.
You shouldn't drink before a fight.
You learned this during your years in the fighting pits. I always drink before a fight.
It could get you killed. It could get me killed.
For generations, however, tragedy was often the default setting for LGBTQ+ characters. That's why deaths like Tara, Lexa, Castiel, and Villanelle sparked such intense reactions. Fans weren't simply mourning fictional characters. They were responding to decades of storytelling that repeatedly suggested queer people could find happiness, but only briefly before it was taken away. The encouraging thing is that the conversation itself has already changed television and film. Audiences recognize the trope now. Writers know viewers are paying attention. And increasingly, queer characters are being allowed something that once felt surprisingly rare in mainstream entertainment: the chance to survive, thrive, and live happily ever after.
Tell you what, we could have had a good life together. Fucking real good life. Had us a place of our own. But you didn't want it, Ennis. So what we got now is Brokeback Mountain.
Thanks for watching the Pride Channel. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments. Until next time, stay proud.